Hello everyone, Ian Bremmer here, and today we are bringing you something a little different, actually very different for us. I've gathered some people, some voices from around Eurasia Group, which is the political risk firm I founded some 25 years ago, and G0 Media, part of that whole thing, our public-facing global affairs media company, and to talk about the Middle East, to talk about Israel and Hamas. We all know since the terrorist attacks of October 7th, this is the most urgent and complicated geopolitical issue that we've been dealing with in the headlines, but it's also one of the most difficult to talk about because the climate is so polarized, because the acts of violence and hate are increasing, because the threats of the conflict growing are real, and because people feel so strongly about it. And this is a story where the personal is political and the political is very personal. So how do we at Eurasia Group talk about this situation fairly and accurately and productively to bring understanding and insight to everyone, but also to avoid falling into, I hate you and I won't listen to you. And you're wrong. Well, today we want to talk openly and honestly about how we are approaching the Middle East conflict, the Israel-Hamas war, both as analysts and journalists across our company, and also as human beings that are part of this little planet we have. And I am joined by Evan Solomon, publisher of G0 Media, Raad Alkadiri, managing director of our Energy, Climate, and Resources Group, Omar Monieb, a senior analyst in our Middle East and North Africa practice, and Amaka Anku, who is the head of Eurasia Group's Africa practice. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Let's jump right in. And I want to talk first about when the terrorist attack happened on October 7th. I mean, I referred to it as Israel's 9/11. It became very clear very quickly that it was much more than that. But there's also historical framing of a conflict that has been impossible to resolve, that everyone has tried their hands at and failed for decades and decades. Talk a little bit to us about how you saw the events of October 7th when they happened. What do they mean to you? How did you think about it? Let me start with Evan. Let's start with Evan.
The events were shocking, and as a human being, everybody was shocked by the level of the violence. In my job, and I've covered conflicts for years, like everybody here, as analysts or as journalists, the first thing you do is you try to understand it. You realize right away that you have to put a context around it, and even the context is political, Ian. As you know, as soon as you begin to talk about this, everything is political. And you have to decide to frame this. How do you understand first the actual events? Because you don't want to diminish human tragedy. That's part of it. You have to account for the human beings who were killed or injured or taken hostage. And then you have to understand the perspective, our job. So I put on my journalist, my publisher hat. And the first thing I think about is how do we begin to frame this and choose our vocabulary and our context? And the context matters. You have to talk about the events of October 7th, but then you have to say, is that the baseline? Does the understanding of the conflict start on October 7th? That's a political statement. In fact, it doesn't. But where does it start? Does it start at the policies of the Netanyahu government? Does it start at the 73 war? Does it start at 1948? Does it start at 1917? So there's all sorts of contextual things that you have to put into perspective to understand the story. Because we knew, and I knew right away, this is not like covering a crime where there's a beginning and an end. This was the beginning of something that would escalate immediately. And so I spoke to our team right away. And the first thing I said is, let's set parameters to make sure that we are covering this fully. We are choosing our words carefully, and we're not succumbing to both sidesism and some kind of simplified dilemma. We're trying to be fair, insightful, with full context, and not losing sight of the humanity and get into some kind of banal both sidesism, and that the coverage would go on for a long time. And that matters because the arc of the coverage is as important as the specific moments of the coverage.
Now, Raad, you did your PhD on this conflict. You've been dealing with it for a long time. You've also focused a lot on a lot of intransigent conflicts across the Middle East. I know you and I have talked about Iran. And if you're, on one side of that conflict, it started in 1979 with the revolution. If you're on the other side, it started in, 56 with the American coup, right? Just two completely different frames of history that make you feel completely different about the conflict. And we have kind of the same thing in much, much deeper, more hostile fashion, right? Much more entrenched when we talk about the Jews and the Palestinians. So how did you internalize all this information suddenly coming? You knew it was really important. What were you thinking at the time?
I think my wife would say that I stuff it down into my boots and deal with the emotion later. You choose to be in this business and you choose to sort of deliver value to clients in this business. And I think the first thing that I do in a crisis like this is try and switch off emotion. I feel very strongly about certain parts of this conflict. I grew up in the Middle East. I've had, family, friends sort of hurt, killed, etc., directly as a result of this conflict. So, but you can't bring that baggage to the work that we do. It can inform you. I think it informs an understanding of at least one side of the conflict. And, 4 years of dating a rabbi's daughter taught me the other side of the conflict. So, you pick up things.
I wasn't even going to go there. I didn't even know that about you.
There you go. You get to pick up both sides. But I think what it becomes is, look, what's our job fundamentally as a firm, and, what's the value we bring? It is to look around corners. It is to try and anticipate what hasn't been anticipated. It's to tell people something different and something useful in terms of their business and their outlook. And that requires, I think, stepping away from the emotion. Evan is absolutely right in terms of where do you start this? But, the moment you get into that game, it sort of doesn't benefit you either. So you start to look at, what does this do to the tectonic plates? What is this likely to do moving forwards? One of the things you've learned, as you know, Ian, about doing a PhD is you tend to look back. That's part of the rules of doing a PhD. They don't want a policy paper. They actually want sort of research that can be substantiated. But I think, in this circumstance, it's not about, it's understanding those dynamics. It's trying to understand it from both sides. And I think it's, personally, it's always about thinking about what I'm writing and what I'm saying and how it looks to different audiences. And that's not to be banal, but to be able to sort of be sure that, it's giving some signposts for the future that's useful, but also that it isn't sort of completely out of whack so much so that, you are going to lose an audience. And I think, you're never going to sort of please everyone, and nor should we ever try. But I think, that ability to have an impact on the debate, an ability to have an impact on people's thinking comes from being able to reach them. And that's our job.
So, Amaka, I think that you and I are a little closer in how we respond to things than Raad, in the sense that I've never gotten the view from you that you stuff your emotions into your boots, right? People usually know how we're feeling. If we're upset, we're happy, we're not so great. And I have a lot of emotion when I see this kind of carnage, right? I feel for a lot of people that are suffering. I'm not just turning on one part of my brain, but I feel like that, for me at least, that connection helps me to not forget that these are all human beings. They're all human beings. Yeah. Talk a little bit about how you're responding.
So first, I will say, yes, totally. It's very hard for me to hide my emotions. I'll say that I actually have still refused till this day to watch a lot of videos for October 7th because I just don't do well with those things. I understand what's happened. I've read about it. I've listened to other people. But I will say I totally agree with what Evans and Raad has said, which is what we do so well here at Eurasia Group is first understand the context. And I think that was one of the things that we all went and did first. Where what is the context here? What are the perspectives on both sides? I have to say that one of the things I've struggled with is why did it take this to engage with this issue? Why did it take such a brutal, horrid attack for me, and I think many others in the US are probably asking themselves this question, to engage with some of the sort of deep-rooted underlying issues here, right? Particularly from the Palestinian side. Because at least for me, one of the things I realized in grappling with this and engaging with this and going back and listening and reading different perspectives was because I hadn't searched out some of the context and the history, I was just kind of, I was allowing myself to only rely on whatever the dominant narratives were, right? And when I say, what does that mean for me? It means that I had come to really understand Israel's need for security and why, but I hadn't really come to really understand and engage with the Palestinian need for freedom and how those two clashed and connected. I personally hadn't really engaged with that as deeply as I've had to now. And I think it's problematic for me thinking about why did it have to take this, right, to do that?
Thank you, Amaka. So Omar, before we move into some more details around what's happened since and how we approach it, maybe a little bit of, you're in the Middle East practice, you guys are getting just a complete fire hose. You went from everything is more or less normal status quo to I am clearing the decks and this is my entire life going forward. But in a part of the world that you are connected with, that you care very, very deeply about. And talk a little bit about, just how this all affected you in the first hours, days, of the conflict.
Ian, I think it's, as you mentioned, I am personally from this part of the world, right? And I have friends whose families are, for example, from Gaza, currently living in Gaza. I have friends and former colleagues who are in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And the first thought when these attacks happened was personal. I wanted to make sure that people I know, friends, are safe, and then you also start to think about the analytical side of things and how are we going to work on this and what are the repercussions. And at the beginning, I wouldn't say that like Raad, I'm trying to suppress emotions or anything, but I think that when you spend a lot of time in this part of the world, unfortunately, and it's very sad to say this, but you become sort of numb. And, I was just a kid when we had the images from the Gulf War or, for example, from the Intifadas. And back then, they didn't blur images on TV. So imagine you're 6, 7 years old and you see all these graphic images and you grow up with that. And after a while, it is very sad to say this, but you get used to these images. So that was the first part. The first part was that I was concerned, and then I started to think about this analytically, and you always start to think more in the broader picture, right? You don't want to limit this to Israel, Palestine, Israel, Gaza, just Gaza, Hamas. You want to look at the broader picture, and I think this is what we try to do at the MENA practice from day one. Who will be the winners and losers of this war? This is something big. It has never happened before. In previous incidents that were much, 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 smaller in scale than this, we have seen long operations, a high, level of casualties, of human life lost, and of destruction that needs reconstruction and all of that. Before these attacks happened, the Egyptians were still talking with the Israelis, trying to convince them to allow more building material to go into Gaza to rebuild from the destruction of the previous, operation in Gaza. So it is sort of a recurring cycle of events, unfortunately, and you need to start and think globally in the region. And the first thing that we thought about was, and everyone was concerned. When it happened, I was in Cairo. I was on a research trip in Cairo, and it was just, I was coming back to London the next day. And my wife was with me. My wife is French. And she was like, do you think it's safe to take the plane? And I was like, yeah, it is safe to take the plane. This is Cairo. This is far from it. And then I thought afterwards that maybe it's not such a silly question. I don't think that it's unsafe to take a plane out of Cairo or to Cairo. But many people around the world are actually thinking that. And we were talking in some of the discussions that we were having at the firm. I was talking to one of our clients, and he was saying that he is canceling a trip to Jordan in March. So, people get worried very fast, and the effects of this on the region are felt in different sectors and in different ways. And that is what we needed to do from the very first day. We were thinking about transshipment in the Red Sea. And I think we were one of the first people to talk about it. We were talking about this on first week. And only last week we have seen significant threats rise in the Red Sea. But these are the things that we need to think about from the go.
I wanted to shift the conversation a little in that environment, because what we've seen over the last 7 weeks, is an environment that has so much misinformation. And we've seen that on many different topics. Some of that misinformation coming from people that support Israel, some of it coming from people that support the Palestinians. I got an email just this morning from a minister from the Gulf who was sending me an article that was written that basically said that Israel had killed most of the civilians on October 7th. It wasn't actually Hamas. And he asked me, what did I think about that? 3 years ago, you wouldn't have gotten a misinformation like that from a senior person. And now it happens all the time. We're dealing with it constantly. So I'm wondering how the misinformation environment, the social media environment, the hatred environment, how that is affecting the work that we're doing. Who wants to jump in? Omar, I see you. You want to jump in on that first? Go ahead.
No, I think misinformation is very challenging. It's very challenging because it's also a matter of perception, and it plays on perceptions, it plays on bias, right? Everyone has their biases, and you get these pieces of information, and depending on where you're coming from, what is your personal background, your history, how you've lived this conflict or past conflicts, and then you're prone to believe or not believe things that could be obvious. And it's a challenge for analysts. It's a challenge for analysts to actually, first of all, filter this information, to try and determine what is true and what is not, and then to try and work around it. And because this issue is very sensitive, you are very sensitive when you are, for example, dismissing misinformation, because what could seem obvious to you could be very sensitive to the person receiving this analysis of yours, or you saying, this is rubbish, this is not true. Or, for example, this video is made up, it's not true. And it is very challenging. And I think that we spend, I would say, not half the time, but we spend a good portion of the time when we're producing analysis carefully, very carefully choosing our words, the terminology that we use. And this is a big challenge, yeah, definitely.
I think it's the pace of misinformation. I'm not sure that the amount of misinformation. Of course, yeah. I mean, again, as somebody who's spent most of their life covering Middle East issues, the amount of misinformation, the amount of he said, she said, the amount of, this is it, no. Now, it used to be, it would come out in articles, it would come out in books, it would, be, in media shows. Now it's, it is just the pace, the volume, and the proximity, I think, of that information and how fast it moves across the world. But, I can remember sort of, again, back in the 80s when I first started looking at the Arab-Israeli conflict seriously. You'd pick up one book and it would sort of give you a version of history. You'd pick up another book and it would give you another version of history. I mean, professionally, it was the same with Iraq in the run-up to the 2003 war and beyond. And, having seen it from a policymaker's point of view, having worked in the British government during that period, seeing what was actually happening and, what was being reported, or even sort of different interpretations of what was happening. I think it's all part and parcel of the game. But
Raad, but the argument about history, which history is an argument, that's different than disinformation, I think, don't you think? And I think one has consequentially different impacts.
It depends. So what I'm saying is, at this moment in time, there's absolutely no doubt that social media encourages misinformation and it encourages echo chambers. I mean, if I go on to my Twitter account, quite honestly, I could easily fall into a trap of not hearing anything I didn't want to hear. And I think, we're all aware of that and we work with that all the time. I actually do think that the level of misinformation, if you're a young undergrad student and you're picking up a book, you have no context. You read that book and that shapes how you think. And
you're not picking up books, Raad, you're checking TikTok.
No, but what I'm saying is in terms of the history, that misinformation was there, that at least that effort to change or drive perception in one way or another, missing out facts, re-importing facts. I mean, my supervisor was Avi Schlein, who, made a name for himself as a revisionist Israeli historian. I mean, he rewrote the history of Israel, and in a way that was much more palatable to Arabs.
Yeah, I think Raad's point is important because you have different readings of history, right? I mean, it's like the misinformation wars. I think there is a sort of a history wars also. I mean, I was probably older when people used to read history books. But now it's easier to just, check your Twitter or X feed or your TikTok videos and you will get a lot of misinformation very easily.
Amaka, go ahead, Amaka.
In some ways, the type of misinformation you just described, in my view, is the easy one to avoid, right? In some ways, I think what's been really hard, and I think what I felt I sort of had some experience dealing with. So for context, I'm from Nigeria, and I cover Nigeria for work, and it's in my view, a very poorly understood country. And it's one of the places where there's so many echo chambers. So I think that for me is what I have sort of tried the hardest to make sure we at Eurasia Group and also just in my research we're not falling into. I think that it's the misinformation echo chambers rather than like the blatant sort of lies about something that most people you can easily find that is the bigger danger. Because you can it's very easy to sort of fall into a comfortable place where you don't know what to believe, because it is hard to figure out what to believe. And when you don't know what to believe, you fall back into your normal paradigms of how you see the world, which, as Omar was saying, is based on your own lived experience, which you will never be the same as somebody else's lived experience. And I think what we've done, so well, is push each other to see the other perspective and get out of that echo chamber, right? I still remember the conversation we were having after there was the bombing of one of the hospitals in Gaza, and nobody knew, was it Israel? Was it Hamas? What, right? And it was, I felt like several people in the chat were pushing to make sure that we weren't just believing what we wanted to believe. Right? Because
especially in that point when the story is being pushed out by like journalists that in principle you respect, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think that to me, Ian, that's the hardest part, is figuring out when, not when it's lies, but it's that when there is a lot of uncertainty and no one actually knows. Right? And then people are making inferences. And it's part of our job, yes, to make informed inferences. But what does your informed inferences, what is it based on? can you make those informed inferences based on different perspectives at the same time, right? That's really hard to do, but I think we've done a good job. We're trying to do a good job.
We're trying. I mean, look, I think one thing that defines all of us is that we're intrinsically not on a team, right? I mean, we're on team human being, but I mean, we're not like intrinsically on team Israel or team Palestine. And you know, I do see disinformation is easier to deal with because in principle, as long as you understand that you need to spend the time to dig, you can figure it out. Where you also have irreconcilable narratives and feelings about like fundamental rightness, that the Palestinians are deeply oppressed and have had their land taken away from them, and they have the righteous story, and the Jews are the chosen people, and they had the most unspeakable crime in humanity committed against them, and now they are the righteous cause. And it's very hard, right, to bridge if that's your narrative. And so I'm wondering who wants to pick up right now on what you find to be the most challenging, irreconcilable narratives and how to start to address them.
I think you just touched on it. It is, you know, two populations that feel massive injustice and feel absolute righteousness in terms of their policies. You know, that goes to the heart of the problem. I mean, you know, it is recognizing that a solution to this is going to require compromise, not just in terms of policy or in terms of land, but compromise in terms of identity, compromise in terms of the whole ideology that's driven you. You know, and then taking, you know, and wrapping into that decades of suffering and decades of, you know, personal loss and personal emotion. And one of the things, you know, Ian, you know this better than anybody, but, you know, one of the things that's always struck me in government and in dealing with policymakers is they're human beings too. They bring their own baggage to this. And so you look at somebody like Bibi Netanyahu and you can say, you know, yes, he's the most cynical politician alive. But then you look at his family history and you look at sort of, you know, the suffering that he's been through. Why wouldn't he be shaped that way? I think, you know, what's remarkable about the great statesmen of the world, the Mandelas, and in this case, you know, probably the Rabins, who, you know, were able to step away from that and see the bigger picture. They are very, very few and far between. So as we look at the irreconcilables, they both want the same piece of land and they both see each other as a threat and they're not willing to compromise to get there. And I think over time, you know, there has been, I think as you get stronger, as the Israelis have, they've been able to push a much tougher agenda. And the Palestinians have suffered from ridiculous lack of leadership and from an Arab world that has, you know, carried their cause, but is quite willing to sort of dump them sort of at a moment's notice if it's going to get you economic benefit. So, you know, those are the irreconcilables. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, Canada, India, a lot easier, right? To put on the back burner until the case is done, so you have information. Why? Because the Canadians are like, they're wealthy. Yeah, it was wrong. It was against rule of law. They shouldn't have killed that one person. But, right, like, there isn't this level of existential threat.
And that's the word. It's the existential element of this. And, you know, breaking through that has been virtually impossible. And there are so many parties to this. It's not just the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that assumes that the Israelis and the Palestinians are, you know, homogenous groups. They're not. So as you start to sort of break down everyone who plays in this, it's very difficult to find a solution that is lasting. There's a logical one. We all see it. We all talk about it. But agreeing to it, that's a different thing.
So, Evan, did I just offend you as a Canadian or as a Jew? I'm not sure.
You always offend me as a Canadian. No. And this is our favorite. No, you know, I think actually, Ian, your point is a really interesting one. What are the irreconcilables? I think there's two kind of on the broader, like let's just go 30,000 feet for a second. One of the reconcilables is the reductionism and the simplification. And the second one is the narrative of hopelessness, which I find both of these sincerely unhelpful. And let me just quickly on the reductionism. Reduce it to pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, meaningless categories. Israel is, and Amaka talked about it like Nigeria, like every country, striated, protests. They have a very robust political system where people are criticizing multiple parties. Netanyahu's 80% unpopular. So being pro-Israel is not pro-Netanyahu policy. It's like, I think Israel has the right to exist. Pro-Palestinian is also. Are you talking about the PA? Are you talking about Hamas? Are you talking about the multiplicity of voices and groups? And then the Arab world, we talk about that. We don't differentiate between Qatar and the United Emirates, Arab Emirates, or Saudi Arabia, or Lebanon, and the influence that Iran has on. So we reduce these things to these binary choices, which actually obscure things and actually play into the partisans that want the conflict. And then the second thing. So the reductionism makes this irreconcilable. And I really, we're not perfect. We all do this stuff. But we try to avoid those generalizations that actually are unhelpful. And then the second thing is the hopelessness. People talk about this is an intractable problem. It will never, all of us inherited a world where the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. And yet we trade with them, and we're great. Germany and France, how many bloody wars and millions of people lost, and yet they're part of the the EU. We have seen countries come together. Now, you're right, Ian, that the existential problem elevates this. But the idea that there is no hope, and we've seen Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, lots of statespeople and statesmen come together, giving back land to try to get close to peace. So the idea that this is, this will, people say, the Jews and the Arab world, they'll never have peace. Completely ridiculous. People who have fought bloodier wars and long intractable conflicts Ireland have found a way to peace. And I think we should avoid reductionism, or try to, and avoid hopelessness, because the triumph of the radicals depends on accepting both of those premises, and I find that's.
I want to go from there. I'm going to take the other side of that. I don't like reductionism, and I certainly hate hopelessness, and yet I look over the last several weeks of war, and what I see is an Israeli population that is far more unified, more reduced in terms of we've got to destroy Hamas no matter what. Even the far left, because a lot of them were the ones that were killed, the civilians in the south. So there's much more unity. And there's much more unity on the Palestinian side in responding to all of these bombs that are killing civilians, even though Hamas is putting the civilians in harm's way. And they're feeling a lot more hopeless because, look at what their economic possibilities could possibly be. Look at the damage that these kids are going to be facing, those that survive, for the rest of their lives. So you're radicalizing so many people. So how do we given what we are now seeing, I understand that analytically, these are all different people. Everyone's unique. Everyone has a different political perspective. But it feels like we're actually heading towards years and years of a much more divided and irreconcilable conflict. Am I wrong about that, Omar?
No, I don't think you're wrong, Ian. I think it's you have I don't want to say that I am hopeless about it, but I'm sort of. It's very difficult. Evan, you mentioned Sadat and Rabin. They were both assassinated, right? So it gives you an idea of what happens also, on how people are reacting to these things in that part of the world. And you Ian, you mentioned the destruction and what's happening in Gaza right now. And, imagine you are born in Gaza in, let's say, 2003. You're 20 years old now. You've never been outside of Gaza. You've lived in very, very difficult conditions, to say the least. How is that person not radicalized? And when you look at what's happening now and what continues to happen, because again, as I said before, this is a cycle that keeps repeating itself, unfortunately and sadly. And I honestly don't see much hope on that side. And I also, even as an analyst, I would say that you don't have the leadership on either side that can negotiate something and like a permanent solution. Right now, I don't see it, and I also don't see a U.S. who is capable of bringing everybody together to the table of negotiations. I mean, the U.S. has been disengaged from this for the past decade or so, and when it was perceived as a big injustice from the Palestinian side when Trump was pushing for his peace deal of the century.
And it's increasingly divided inside the United States as well. Raad, go ahead.
No, it goes to that point, and it goes back to your first point, your first question, Ian, about how do we handle things like this, and it's knowing what is noise and what is signal. And I think Omar's point is absolutely spot on, and the point you were making. Look, if you say the massacre of 23 in 10 years' time, it will mean something entirely different to the Palestinians than it does to the Israelis. Because they will take whatever piece of this, understandably, that most tragically affected them, and that will shape their worldview moving on. And it's one of the reasons why I think this particular war isn't the same as ones that have gone past. And I think some of the analogies that have been drawn, whether it's been operations in Gaza before, or whether it's been tit for tat, or whether it's been Palestinian terrorism in Israel, I think we're looking at something more fundamental. And 1982 strikes me as the example that we may want to look at, where a security event actually led to an attempt by Israel to alter the political and security dynamics in the Middle East fundamentally, and completely redraw the Palestinian issue. Now, that was disastrous, but, you can draw a direct line from there to Hamas and Hezbollah. So I think, this may well actually be one of those crises where, unfortunately, it diminishes hope, or it reduces the hope rather than increases it. And that fundamentally people are going to fall back, as human beings sometimes do, on the tragedy and let that shape them, as opposed to this being a wake-up call. And I don't see anybody as yet at a senior political level who is seeing this as a wake-up call to do something brave.
Outside of the United States, go ahead, Omar. Then I'm going to Amaka, but Omar, go ahead.
No, I think because it's also, Raad, I think it's politically difficult for anyone today to talk about peace, whether on the Israeli side or on the Palestinian side. It's difficult to talk about peace today. You will not have anyone, your constituency will simply not listen to you if you talk about peace today.
Exactly.
I was going to say, it's clear that the United States is very divided on this issue and does not have a leader that is going to drive a peaceful outcome on either side of the political aisle. The Chinese certainly don't seem to have that. I'm wondering, Amaka, do you see leaders from other parts of the world that you think are going to play a more significant role? No, as we think about, these narratives of oppression, these narratives of we have been mistreated globally, right? I mean, there are a lot of those around the world, and it's precisely the leaders, frequently men, but not always, that are rising up above that and showing their people that they can be more than just the destructive tendencies that come from having been pushed down. And okay, I'm not expecting a second coming here, but where do you see potential hope and leadership?
So, I've, listening to this conversation, I was struggling with, the juxtaposition of Evan's comment about we don't want hopelessness and, we don't want reductionism. And Omar and Raad saying, well, it is kind of hopeless. I think where I come out, look, I think I'm okay with acknowledging hopelessness, like in some ways. Like maybe we don't want to say it's completely hopeless, but I do think acknowledging just how intractable, even if we want to hope that there could be a solution, just how unjust the situation has been, it will probably continue to be. I'm okay with that because maybe it allows us, even if there isn't a solution, I think us being able to be honest with ourselves about what the status quo means, right? Of there still being oppression and there still being victimhood on both sides, right? Like, I feel like that is maybe a more fair outcome, even if there isn't a solution immediately, is that we're just actually just dealing with like just how complicated the situation is. But to your question, Ian, I don't think that there is really any hope for leadership anywhere else outside of the United States. The United States is the only country that can get Israel to do anything. And the status quo is that right now, Israel is the more powerful actor, I guess, in this situation in terms of state power and military power. So I don't see any leader from the global south being able to change the status quo. I don't see anybody else being able to change the status quo. And some people might argue that, these kinds of situations and attacks is maybe the only thing that forces people to think about changing the status quo. That's very hard for me to sort of grapple with and live with, right? Because that's not what it shouldn't be. That maybe it is. It shouldn't be, right? But yeah, I think that maybe where we can see leadership, to your point, is how do we leaders from where I come from, what we call the global south, people, developing countries who are used to being kind of at the bottom of the global pyramid, at the periphery of the global economy, in some ways, feeling oppressed one way or the other by something in the global system. Maybe the leadership is to figure out how to tell this story, tell a narrative that forces everybody to grapple with, like, how do we actually live with, how do we juxtapose the oppression of some people with the need for security and just talk about it honestly and openly, right? Like, maybe that's the leadership, is just being able to talk about it honestly and openly and seeing both sides, right?
I mean, there's got to be.
Can I ask you a question, Ian? Because
yes,
I think Amaka mentioned something interesting when she was saying that the United States is the only one who could actually push Israel on the negotiation table, and I'm wondering what is the tipping point for the U.S. at which it decides, or it says that, as a U.S. administration, like, let's speak about Biden now, what is the tipping point beyond which he is losing by supporting Israel rather than winning his constituency or his votes? And when does this tipping point make any American administration act?
Look, it's interesting. I think Biden's support for Israel is very deeply held, and it's personal. It's something he believes in. And Biden may be 81 years old, but the fact is he's been doing foreign policy for decades and decades, and he feels like he actually can hold his own counsel on many of these issues. That's why he keeps talking about democracy versus authoritarianism, even though his advisors keep telling him it's not useful. You're undermining like a lot of important relationships you have in the Gulf. You're sort of annoying people. He doesn't care. Like, that's his view. He's very strongly in favor of Israel, and the opposition he's getting among the Democrats, and it's a majority of the Democrats that feel like he's gone way too far, which will affect his presidential election. I think a lot of other leaders in his position would be tactically pivoting away and taking Macron's position, for example, or something a little bit more, Trudeau's position, something more balanced. I don't think that Biden is there, and I don't think he will be there. So, and that's, at the end of the day, the U.S. is never going to be seen as an honest broker between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israel is America's strongest ally, and they're still going to spend the $3 billion plus a year and all of that. But I think it's hard to imagine in this environment that the United States is going to drive what will ultimately be a breakthrough on peace. They have leverage over the Israelis, but that leverage is limited and is also not particularly welcome on the part of the actors. So, look, I think that for me, this conversation has been just really elucidating, not because we're suddenly resolving any issues, but because we're trying to show everybody why it's so hard, right? And we're doing it without saying we think that, we all know that Hamas committed terrorist atrocities. We all know that the Israeli government is in large part responsible for the environment that has gotten us to October 7th. And we all know that it's not getting fixed anytime soon. But we need to find a way to address those issues constructively, both so we can all talk to each other, but also so we can help other people understand where this is all going.
Thanks, Ian. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good to chat as always. Our frank discussions, always open, honest, and great. Appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Amaka, Omar, Raad, Evan, and thank you to all of you and to all of you that are watching. And I'm sure we'll be with you again real soon.